follow that.
Indeed. Well, if that's Derek when he's not prepared, then I'd love to see him one day when he is, because I think that was very powerful. And I'm not very well organised because I've been. Alan talked in the introductory session about the fact that organising this tour on the question of food sovereignty and having the privilege to bring Maria here has been a steep learning curve for socialist resistance. It's been particularly a steep learning curve for me because it's been pretty much my life's work for the last 3 months. And at the beginning of the process, I knew a little bit about what food sovereignty was. I knew a little bit about the struggle in the Philippines because I've worked with the comrades over a period of time, and I knew a little bit about the existence of Via Campesina and their struggles internationally. And certainly, like Derek, I had the privilege to be involved in Ugu's tour last year. But really what I've learned every day, and I expect to go on learning as the tour continues, but also as I continue these discussions with other people long after Maria has gone back to the Philippines, is that the whole question of food, I think, is a really good, horrible, but very vivid illustration of what's wrong with capitalism and what sort of vision we need for a different sort of society. I think if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have talked about the food crisis over there. So I remember the food riots of 2008 when in, I think, something like 52 countries in the world, people took to the streets to protest against the increases in the price of food. One of the most graphic examples, which is talked about in 2 articles in the pamphlet that Socialist Resistance has brought out, which came back from the printers yesterday, and which I urge everybody to get a copy of and to read, is the example of Haiti. Prior to the imposition of neoliberal trade agreements by the IMF and the World Bank, Haiti produced 80% of its own food, and in particular 90% of its own rice. The imposition of neoliberal trade agreements meant that now 90% of Haiti's rice comes from the United States, and that you had a situation where people in Haiti were eating tortillas made from mud. And that seems to me, as Hugo Chavez said, an illustration of the fact that the way that capitalism treats food and treats poor people's right to access food is a real paradigm for the iniquities of capitalism. Some of the discussions I've been in today have raised the question that was mentioned in this morning's plenary of why is capitalism so irrational. I think it's something that we talk about a lot in lots of different contexts, but again, if you take the example of food, you can see it really clearly. One of the things that the massive expansion of agribusiness that we've seen in the last 20 years, but coming on the back of export-led agriculture imposed by the IMF and the World Bank, particularly in Latin America, but also in parts of Asia and Africa in the 80s, is the imposition of massive monocultures. One of the things that anybody who works even the tiniest bit of ground knows, and that certainly we know as eco-socialists, is that monocultures are completely destructive of the earth. Because if you grow one crop, and again, it's another thing that goes back to the struggle of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples know, the world over, that the way you treat the land will affect how the land treats you. If you want to live from scarce resources, you have to tend to them. You have to look after them, and one of the things that means for agriculture is that you have to rotate your crops. In some cultures it also means that you at some points leave your land fallow, as traditional farming did in these islands. In other parts of the world that hasn't been necessary, but you need a rotation that puts the goodness back into the soil. What agribusiness does, for the sake of a fast buck for their coffers, is that it produces acre after acre after acre of the same crop. Why? So that they can reap those crops very quickly, not by human hands, but by machines that don't have to go through any barriers, and they can make a fast buck. And there are parts of Africa today where land grabs took place 10 years ago, where whole vast areas are now being abandoned because that land is infertile. Because in 10 years they took everything out of the soil. But it doesn't stop there, because they're not satisfied with the profits that they get from those yields. So they introduce GM. They introduce more and more pesticides to push up the yields, to say we're not producing enough. Not we're not producing enough to give you and me and poor people around the world an adequate diet, an adequate standard of living, but we're not producing enough to put in their coffers. And so they introduce, well, they did it in India many years ago. They dreamt up this horrible misnomer of the Green Revolution, which was anything but green, which was about pushing up yields, not to feed people, but to feed their profits. They're doing it with GM, and they're doing it with intensive use of pesticides that poison not only the lands where they spray, but get into the water table, in some cases of thousands of miles downstream, poisoning people, both directly and also destroying particularly women's reproductive systems, so that you get health problems going on from generation to generation because of their greed. This is what the food system that we have today is about. And I think it is a very good example of how capitalism, even for itself, is unable to plan, because it isn't even very logical from their point of view, because then they have to go somewhere else to make some more profit, because they've even from their own point of view, they've used up the resources. But also, as we discussed this morning, we have a situation where it's been around the question of food that we've seen some of the strongest resistances. The question of food prices was absolutely integral to the question of the Arab Spring, the revolutions that we've seen over the last year in Egypt. The question of food prices was a critical part of the spark that led to Tahrir Square, which I think has been one of the key inspirations which has led to the Occupy movement that Derek talked about. In Tunisia, the spark that led to the revolution was when a young vegetable and fruit seller set himself alight because he wasn't allowed. He was a typical guy who'd been forced to leave his land in the countryside to go into the city to eke out a living selling produce on the side of the road, and he didn't have the right permit, so the police confiscated his produce, and he then doused himself in paint thinner and set himself alight. And that was the spark that led to the revolution in Tunisia. Of course, in both Egypt and Tunisia, there were many other things that were already bubbling up and so on, but food was a crucial part of that. And as people said this morning, it's very interesting that you know, in a situation where, for example, in Europe, we had with the eruption of Seattle, we had a whole development of the social forums in Europe, which was very powerful. But actually, Via Campesina, the international movement of peasants, and I do say peasants, because I think we should challenge the notion in Britain that to call somebody a peasant is a swear word, and reclaim the notion that working the land is an occupation worthy of status among eco-socialists in particular, and not allow that divide and rule. Via Campesina has been a very strong and vibrant part of the movement for global justice, even at times where, before the Occupy movement was reborn, the movement in many European countries went into some abeyance. And I think what Pierre said about the way that the movement for agroecology, the movement that Maria and other comrades of the South represent, have actually taken a bit of, you know, a traditional revolutionary program of workers' control and actually looked at what it is we produce, how do we produce for human need, not human greed, and translated that in a very concrete way, has to be an inspiration to us. And I think it has to be a challenge that we take into the Occupy movement, not in a sort of, you know, we've got all the answers, but in dialogue with the camps, with the people who are inspired by the camps, who are many thousands more than those people who are directly involved in the Occupy movement. Because when we say we are the 99%, that means what it says. And therefore, to be the 99%, we have to have answers, not just to combating directly the power of the banks in the city, but combating the way that the banks' tentacles control everything, including the food industry, which goes back to what Derek says about speculation. So I was very pleased to see in the programme of the Tent University in London that Graciela is doing a session on food sovereignty tomorrow night, and if anybody's free at 6 o'clock, I would strongly urge you to come down to St Paul's and hear her talk. And that we weren't able to get Maria a slot this week, but I hope that we can get her a slot later in her visit to London. She already visited the small tent city in Leeds on Friday morning, because I think that one of the things Derek talked about, the example of Cuba, it's not just the example of Cuba, but in Venezuela too, there's been an attempt to break down, as Graciela talked about this morning, this division between town and country. It's not finished. There are many problems in all those societies that we don't have time to talk about now. But we also see examples from the States, where in big bits of cities like Detroit, where you've got vast areas of the city that have now been depopulated because of deindustrialization. You've got big guerrilla gardening projects going on, serious attempts to regrow food, and regrow food in an environmentally sustainable and an organic way that destroys the power, or at least undercuts the power of agribusiness, and in particular the power of the supermarkets, whose control both over our pockets and our health is determined by them having the monopoly on the supply of food that those of us who live in the cities have. There are, you know, we've seen in this country the rebirth, or the re-strengthening of, for example, of the movement around allotments, something that the left hasn't taken much notice of in general. But it seems to me that in the same way that increasingly as eco-socialist and socialist resistance, we understand things like the fight for freedom to roam,
yeah,
which was part of the fight of the workers' movement against long work hours by the bosses, and then the enclosure into cities. That the right to roam the countryside was part of the struggle of the workers' movement. So it seems to me the right to access to land and the right to access to food is part of our struggle. But of course, in order to complete that struggle, the question of international solidarity between movements in the south and movements in the north has never been more necessary. Globalization reduces the size of the world that we live in. That brings many difficulties for us, but it also brings many opportunities. And I hope that we can go forward from today, in particular from sharing from Maria and the other comrades in the Philippines, struggle more determined to fight on tomorrow, and to take forward the battle for food sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. It's quite night. It's already dark, but I want to thank you for all those who come here to listen to my sharing. I come not as the discussions of all those things in food sovereignty and all the campaigns, but they come from the ground, specifically from the south of the Philippines, as a way of sharing to you how the peasants in the ground work on this campaign in food sovereignty and